End of the month, boy, and I'm too short. So tonight we go out there and we shake the right trees until something useful falls out. Officer Derek Pruitt said it the same way a man might describe picking up groceries on the way home. His voice flat and unbothered, his thick fingers working the last brass button of his duty shirt closed without looking down at them. The locker room of the 14th Precinct smelled the way it always smelled at the end of a night shift, old coffee and rubber soles and the particular kind of tired that settles into walls and never really leaves, and Pruitt moved through it like he owned every square inch of floor, which in many ways after 22 years he did. He was 51 years old, broad across the shoulders in a way that had more to do with time than fitness, with platinum silver hair cropped close on the sides and a face that had the carved, weathered look of someone who had spent 2 decades deciding things about other people without being questioned about it. The badge on his chest was scratched along the lower left corner from a traffic stop in 2019, a detail that nobody else would notice, but that Pruitt kept there deliberately, the way some men keep a scar visible because they like what it says about them. He opened his lower locker and reached past the folded rain jacket and the spare baton and picked up a small plastic sandwich bag, the kind you'd use to store a child's afternoon snack, except what was inside was not a snack. And Pruitt's fingers closed around it with the ease of a man picking up his car keys, practiced casual, utterly without ceremony. He slipped it into the left cargo pocket of his uniform pants and pressed the flap down. Officer Ryan Kelso was 26 years old, 8 months out of the academy, and had the unfortunate luck of being assigned to Pruitt's unit for what was supposed to be a standard 4-week rotation that had somehow stretched into 3 months. He was sitting on the bench with his clipboard propped on his knee, filling out a vehicle log, and his pen had been clicking up and down against the metal edge of the clipboard for the last 4 minutes without him noticing he was doing it the way a person fidgets when they want to say something and have decided not to. He looked up when Pruitt spoke, but he did not ask about the plastic bag because there were things in this precinct that you learned not to ask about if you wanted to get through your shift in one piece and go home to your apartment and your dog and your life. Quota's a performance issue, Kelso said, because he had to say something, and that was technically true. Quota's whatever I say it is. Pruitt closed the locker with a sound that rang off the cinder block and picked up his duty belt. Tonight we work Eastfield. You know Eastfield. Kelso knew Eastfield. It was the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were kept and the cars were new, and most of the residents were black. And he had noticed in the careful notebook-keeping part of his brain that he had not yet found a use for that Pruitt's arrest record in Eastfield was 3 times what it was anywhere else in the district. "There's a woman I've been keeping an eye on," Pruitt said, adjusting the gun on his hip with the slow satisfaction of someone settling into a chair they've sat in 1,000 times. "Nadia Cole. Works out of the DA's office. Put 3 of my boys away last spring on a corruption case. 3 good cops with families and mortgages gone because some woman in a suit decided she was better than the system that keeps this city running." He said the name the way you say the name of someone you have been waiting on. "She drives a gray Lexus. She works late." Kelso's pen stopped clicking. Pruitt walked out without looking back, and Kelso sat there alone in the yellow light of the locker room with the clipboard on his knee and the pen still in his hand, and he looked at his own reflection in the dark metal of the locker door for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, and then he stood up and followed. The rain had started around 10, and by 11:40 it was coming down in genuine sheets, the kind that makes the streetlights look like they're bleeding orange onto the asphalt, and Nadia Cole was standing under the overhang of the Fulton County Courthouse with her heavy leather briefcase in one hand and 4 inches of trial prep in the other, and her eyes closed for exactly 3 seconds as before she opened them again and stepped toward the parking structure. She was 34 years old, 5 feet 4, with the kind of precise, deliberate energy that made people in courtrooms sit up straighter without fully understanding why, and the navy blazer she was wearing had a small crease along the left shoulder from where she had been leaning against the conference room wall for the last 2 hours of witness preparation, and the right heel of her left shoe had a hairline crack along the sole from standing on courthouse tile all morning, and she had not had time to change them because there had not been time for anything except the work. Before she reached her car, she did a thing she had been doing every single evening for the past 3 months, so automatically now that she barely registered it as a decision anymore, she reached up to the left lapel of her blazer and pressed her fingertip against the sleek black pin. fastened there. A small thing that looked exactly like a designer piece of jewelry, smooth and oval and unremarkable. She felt the tiny vibration, one pulse confirming, and her hand came back down. The pin had been purchased 11 weeks ago, the morning after a phone call that came at 3:17 a.m. The caller was male, the voice controlled and deliberate, and what he said was 4 words: "Be careful, driving home." Then the line went dead. Nadia had sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time. After that, her phone in both hands, thinking not about fear, but about evidence, because fear was a thing that happened to you, whether you prepared for it or not, and evidence was a thing you could build. The Lexus was parked on level 2 bay 17, and she unlocked it and set her briefcase on the passenger seat and sat for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the small, wide-angle lens of the dual dash cam mounted just below the rearview mirror. She reached up and adjusted the angle a fraction of an inch, not because it needed adjusting, but because the habit of checking was something she had decided to keep, like a pilot running through instruments before takeoff. And then she looked at the empty passenger seat, the untouched floor mat, the clean black upholstery, and she started the car. She pulled out of the parking structure and merged onto Westheimer Road, both hands at 10 and 2, speed exactly at the posted limit of 35 miles per hour, the windshield wipers cutting steady arcs through the rain. The laundromat on the corner of Eastfield and Monroe had closed at 9, and its parking lot was a dark rectangle of wet asphalt with a single overhead lamp fizzing at the far end. And Pruitt had pulled the cruiser in there with the lights off and the engine idling at a low murmur, angled toward the main road the way a fisherman angles toward water. Kelso was in the passenger seat, filling out the log, his pen moving steadily across the page, and if someone had looked at him from outside the vehicle, they might have thought he was simply doing the paperwork, part of the job, which is what he was trying to look like he was doing, which was not the same thing as what he was actually doing, which was watching Pruitt out of the corner of his eye and keeping a careful count of every minute that passed without incident. Pruitt was chewing on something that wasn't there, a habit he had when he was paying very close attention, and his eyes were on the road in the focused, patient way of a man who has done this before and knows that what he's waiting for will come if he simply waits long enough. The Lexus appeared at the top of the block at 11:52, moving at the speed limit, headlights cutting clean lines through the rain. Pruitt saw it and went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness, less relaxed, more compressed, the way a coil tightens before it releases, and he watched it pass without moving for 5 full seconds. Then, without saying anything to Kelso, he put the cruiser in drive and rolled out of the lot. "Artie," Kelso looked up from the log. "Plates are clean. I ran them this afternoon. Registered to a Nadia Cole Eastfield address. No priors, no warrants, nothing." Pruitt said nothing. He was already 2 car lengths behind the Lexus, close enough that his headlights would have been visible in Nadia's rearview mirror. Inside the Lexus, Nadia's eyes moved to the mirror at the first sensation of headlights, and she registered the shape of the cruiser's light bar before she registered anything else about it, and her heart did one hard, irregular beat that she breathed through without changing the position of her hands on the wheel. She activated her turn signal and moved smoothly into the right lane. The cruiser moved right. She moved back left. The cruiser moved left. She exhaled slowly through her nose and looked back at the road and kept both hands exactly where they were, because she had known this was coming in some form since the phone call at 3:17 a.m., and she had spent 3 months preparing for it, and the tiny device on her lapel was recording everything, and the camera under her rearview mirror was recording everything, and all she had to do right now was stay in her lane and drive the speed limit and wait. The Shell station on the corner of Eastfield and Dupree ran 24 hours and had 4 overhead canopy lights that together produced enough brightness to read a newspaper by and when Nadia saw it coming up on her right. She did not hesitate. She put her signal on a full 100 feet before the turn came off the road in a wide, clean arc and pulled all the way forward under the brightest cluster of lights where anyone standing within 50 yards could see inside her car without difficulty. She shifted into park, and before she did anything else, she reached across all 4 window controls on the driver's side armrest and pressed them down together, all 4 windows dropping simultaneously into the door panels, cold wet air flooding the cabin, rain misting lightly across her arm. Then she placed both hands flat on the top of the steering wheel, fingers spread, and she waited. The cruiser pulled in behind her at an angle, lights strobing red and blue across the wet concrete, and Pruitt got out alone, telling Kelso to stay in the vehicle with one short word that Kelso did not argue with. He took his time coming around. He shone his flashlight through the rear passenger window, first, then the rear driver's window, sweeping the back seat with the beam in the slow, theatrical way that was less about looking for something and more about making the person in the car feel watched and small. He reached the driver's door and stopped, and he tilted the beam directly into Nadia's face. "Well," Pruitt said, and his voice had that particular texture of forced friendliness that is indistinguishable from threat. "If you have heard it often enough, what do we have out here on a night like this?" "Nice car. Good evening, officer." Nadia's eyes stayed level despite the light, and her voice was measured and unhurried, in the way of someone who had made a decision before the conversation started about exactly how they were going to conduct themselves throughout it. Pruitt lowered the flashlight a few inches enough that he could see her face clearly, and he looked at it with the squinting sideways assessment of a man searching for the reaction he wants. He held out his hand. "License, registration, insurance." She reached into the center console with the smooth, announced movement of someone who had rehearsed this, reaching into my center console and produced her wallet, opened it, and handed the documents across in a single neat package. Pruitt took the license and held it at arm's length, tilting it toward his flashlight, and Nadia watched his face in the way you watch a person's face when you already know what they're about to realize. And she saw the moment it happened, a fractional tightening around his eyes, the kind of thing most people would miss. And then he handed everything back without comment and moved to the rear of the vehicle without explanation, and she heard the beam of his flashlight sweeping the interior through the back glass. He came back to her door a moment later and leaned his forearm on the roof, close enough that she could see the patch of platinum hair at his temple, and when he spoke again, the friendliness was entirely gone, replaced by something older and more direct. "I'm picking up a strong odor of marijuana coming out of this vehicle," he said. "Step out." Nadia looked straight ahead through the windshield for one breath. Then, "There's nothing here." 2 words, clean and flat, and she opened the door and stepped out into the rain. She stood beside the car with her hands visible at her sides, and she moved slowly, announcing each action before she made it, and the lapel pin on her blazer was angled outward toward Pruitt's body in the way she had positioned it before she got out of the car, and the interior dashcam had a clear and unobstructed view of the passenger seat, the floor mats, the door panels, all of it empty and undisturbed in the overhead light of the shell canopy. Pruitt moved behind her and took hold of her left wrist, his fingers cold and considerably tighter than any standard protocol required, and guided both arms behind her back in a way that put a sharp pull through her shoulder socket that she absorbed without sound. And she felt the difference between how he held her and how any legitimate traffic stop was supposed to feel, and she filed it away. Kelso had gotten out of the cruiser and was standing about 15 feet back, his arms crossed loosely, and he looked at the empty passenger seat through the open window with the expression of a person who has added a column of numbers and gotten a sum he didn't want and is adding them again. Pruitt released Nadia's wrists, not into handcuffs, not yet, and moved to the driver's side of the Lexus, leaning in, and she heard the sound of the center console being opened and papers being scattered across the seat and the glove box, and then the briefcase being lifted and inverted case files and legal pads spilling across the floor in a way that she knew would take her 40 minutes to reassemble, and she kept her eyes on a fixed point across the parking lot, and her breathing stayed even. He moved to the passenger side. She could not see him from where she stood, but the dash cam could, and what the dash cam saw, what she would watch later on a screen, pausing and rewinding and watching again, until she had every second of it in perfect memory, was this Pruitt's left hand moving at a downward angle toward the passenger floor, and then a pause of approximately 2 seconds, and then the same hand moving not upward from the floor, but upward from the cargo pocket of his uniform pants, the small clear bag pinched between his thumb and index finger in a grip so practiced it looked almost gentle, and then the hand moving under the seat in a slow, deliberate sweep before pulling back out into the open with the bag extended and visible, and his voice already beginning to form the words before his body had fully straightened. "Well, well," Pruitt said, and the satisfaction in his voice was something ancient and ugly and completely unguarded, the kind of sound a person makes when they are not performing for anyone because they believe no one is watching. "Look what we have here, Kelso." He walked back around the vehicle to where Nadia stood and held the bag up in the overhead light, turning it slowly, and she looked at it, and then she looked at his face and she held that eye contact without blinking and without speaking. And whatever he expected to see in her eyes in that moment, panic, collapse, the specific devastation of a person watching their life disintegrate. It was not what was there, and the absence of it made something shift in his expression briefly before the performance reassembled. He stepped behind her, and the handcuffs came out, and the click of them closing around her wrists was a very specific sound, tight metal, the ratchet going 2 stops beyond where it needed to stop, the edge of the cuff pressing into the bone of her left wrist, and she registered every part of that sensation, the way you register something you intend to describe later, with precision, without heat. He walked her toward the cruiser, and she looked back once at the Lexus at the driver's door, still open at the faint red pulse of the dash. Cam light blinking steadily in the dark interior, and she looked at it for exactly as long as she needed to, and then she turned forward and got into the car. In the back of the cruiser, separated from Pruitt and Kelso by the steel mesh partition, Nadia sat with her cuffed hands pressed flat against the hard plastic seat, and she did not speak. She looked out the rain-streaked side window, and she counted the streetlights as they passed. 1, 2, 3, 4. And she thought not about what had just happened, but about what happened next and what happened after that, and the precise sequence of events that would need to unfold between now and a courtroom, and by the time they reached the 14th precinct, she had a clear picture of all of it. Pruitt radioed ahead with the tone of a man announcing a personal accomplishment. Kelso sat in the passenger seat and did not look back through the mesh partition and did not speak for the entire drive, and his thumb pressed rhythmically against the edge of the clipboard in his lap in a pattern that wasn't quite random, like something trying to work its way out. The booking process took 47 minutes, which was roughly 30 minutes longer than it needed to, and Nadia moved through each step of it in the complete controlled stillness of someone who has decided that every second of this will be documented and every unnecessary delay will be useful later. The fluorescent light above the fingerprint station flickered on a 4-second cycle, casting the room in a brief gray pulse that made everything beneath it look older and more defeated than it was. Pruitt pressed her thumb onto the scanner with the full, flat weight of his palm in a way that made her joint ache. And when he lifted his hand, he paused and looked at the name on the screen, the full name printed in the system's clean sans-serif font, and his lips parted a fraction, and Nadia watched that happen with the peripheral calm of a person who has just confirmed something they already knew. Kelso stood in the doorway of the booking room for the entire 47 minutes. He never entered the room fully. He never left it entirely. He stood exactly at the threshold with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the linoleum floor, and that position neither in nor out, neither witness nor participant said everything about the choice he was making and the price it was already costing him. When Pruitt finally indicated the phone, Nadia walked to it without being told twice, and she turned her back. Not rudely, just completely, and she dialed Harold West's cell number from memory. And when he answered, his voice rough with being woken at 1:30 in the morning, she said 2 things, and only 2 things. "Harold, tonight. Come to the 14th. And then, don't move fast. Let him finish everything first." She heard the pause on the line that meant Harold was already processing, already moving from sleep to calculation, and she hung up before he could ask a question she wasn't going to answer. Behind her across the room, Pruitt was talking to a night shift colleague in the low, comfortable voice of a man recounting something that went exactly the way he planned it, and the other officer laughed at something Pruitt said, and Pruitt laughed too, and neither of them was looking at her, which was exactly how she had wanted this to go. The morning news ran the mugshot at 6:15 a.m., on 3 separate channels, and it was the photograph Pruitt had taken on his 7th attempt under the flattest and most unforgiving angle of the booking room light, and it showed a woman who looked cornered and depleted in a way that the previous 6 shots had not quite achieved to his satisfaction, and this one he had accepted. Pruitt watched it on the small television above his kitchen counter, while his coffee brewed standing in his undershirt with one arm braced on the countertop, and his face had the specific quiet satisfaction of a man looking at something he built. And when his wife said something from the other room, he didn't answer, because he was still watching the screen where a news anchor was describing the arrest in the brisk, authoritative shorthand of early morning television. Assistant District Attorney detained on felony narcotics charge. No comment from the DA's office. At the 14th precinct, Pruitt arrived to find 3 people waiting to congratulate him before he reached his locker, and he accepted the acknowledgement with the modest shoulders-back nod of a veteran who expected nothing less and received it anyway. And by the time his shift started, he had told the story of the stop twice to 2 different groups, and both times he used the word routine in a way that made it sound like anything but. District Attorney Frank Odom called Nadia into his office at 8, and the meeting lasted 11 minutes. He was a large, careful man who had spent 30 years in politics learning to weigh outcomes before people had finished describing situations to him, and he sat behind his desk with his hands folded and his eyes doing the rapid sideways calculation of a man measuring distance between himself and a fire. He did not ask her whether the charge was true. He asked her how it would look and what the timeline was and whether she had retained counsel. And when she answered those questions briefly, precisely, without asking for anything, he picked up his pen and signed the administrative suspension order without looking up, and he set it on the edge of the desk facing her. Nadia picked it up and read it and set it back down and stood. She reached to her lapel and removed the black pin, looking at it for a moment with the particular expression of someone putting something valuable somewhere safe, and placed it in the inner pocket of her bag, and she walked out. Harold West's office occupied the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street, and the 2 large monitors on his desk were running a video file on a loop by the time Nadia arrived at 9 o'clock. And when she sat down across from him, he did not say anything for a long moment. Just let the footage play to the end of the relevant segment, and then stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her and his hands in his pockets looking down at the city, and she waited. "He doesn't even hesitate," Harold said finally, still looking at the window. His hand goes in his pocket before he's fully bent down. There's not a frame where it's ambiguous. They watched the footage together twice more after that. And the second time, Nadia noticed that she was watching not her own face on the screen, but Pruitt's hands, specifically the trajectory of the return movement upward from the pocket, rather than upward from the floor, and she pointed at it without speaking. And Harold nodded and made a note on the yellow legal pad beside his keyboard, and neither of them said anything unnecessary for a while. Pruitt, in those same 6 days, had dinner with friends on Tuesday and drinks on Thursday, and told the story twice more to people who wanted to hear it, and he slept soundly each night in the complete, unreflective peace of a man who believes the architecture of the world is built to protect him. Kelso, in those same 6 days, drove his shifts with a replacement partner and did not talk about the stop, and on Wednesday night, he sat in his car in the parking lot of his apartment building for 22 minutes after coming off shift without going inside. And on Friday, he opened his personnel file on his laptop, not to change anything, just to look at his own name there as if confirming he still existed in the way he used to, and then he closed it. When the discovery packet arrived at Harold's office on the morning of the 5th day, he spread the documents across the conference table in a single long row, like evidence at a crime scene, which was what they were. And Nadia stood at the end of the table and read Pruitt's sworn official report without sitting down. Her finger moved along each line at a pace that was slower than her normal reading speed, not because the words were difficult, but because she wanted to be certain of every syllable of every statement he had put his name to under penalty of perjury. Upon approaching the vehicle, I immediately detected a strong, unmistakable odor of marijuana emanating from the cabin. She underlined it with the edge of her fingernail, leaving a faint impression in the paper. The suspect appeared visibly agitated and nervous. Another line. During my search of the passenger side footwell, I discovered a clear plastic bag containing a white, powdery substance hidden beneath the passenger seat. She set the report down on the table and folded her hands on top of it and looked at Harold. He gave us everything Harold said. Nadia picked up the report, tapped it once against the table to square the pages, and slid it into the navy blue folder she had brought with her, the one with the brass clasp, and closed it. 2 days before the preliminary hearing, the supplemental report arrived with the discovery packet's second installment, and it was signed at the bottom by Officer Ryan Kelso, and the handwriting of his signature was slightly different from the print of the rest of the form, smaller, thicker in the downstroke, in the way signatures sometimes look when the hand that makes them is carrying more weight than usual. Nadia read Kelso's supplemental report standing at the counter in Harold's kitchen while Harold made coffee, and she read it the way she read Pruitt's report methodically, without rushing, and when she was done, she set it down flat on the counter and was quiet for a moment. "He put Kelso's name on it to keep him locked in," Harold said from across the kitchen. "If Kelso can't flip without incriminating himself, he stays quiet." "I know why he did it." Nadia looked at the signature for another moment. Kelso had a choice on that road, and he made it. He'll have to carry that. She slid the supplemental report into the Navy folder on top of Pruitt's and closed the brass clasp. But he made another choice when he put his name on a sworn document, and that's between him and his conscience and whatever happens in that courtroom. She picked up the folder and turned it over once in her hands and then set it down on the counter with the clasp side up, and she looked at it the way you look at something that has become more than what it started as, not just a folder now, but the complete physical record of someone's undoing assembled page by page over 6 days waiting. The rain had cleared overnight and left the city washed and sharp-edged in the early morning light, and by 7:30 the block in front of the Fulton County Courthouse had developed its own particular ecosystem. News vans, double-parked with satellite dishes, elevated a cluster of maybe 30 people on the steps with handmade signs supporting Pruitt. Back the Blue Prosecute, the prosecutors, and across the plaza, smaller and quieter, a different group of people who had no signs at all. Just coats and silence and the specific patient stillness of people who have been waiting a long time for something to happen in a building they had stopped trusting. Pruitt arrived at 8:15 in his Class A dress uniform, every commendation he had earned in 22 years pinned to his chest in 2 neat rows, his platinum hair combed back from his forehead with unusual precision, and the union attorney walked at his left shoulder, and the precinct's public relations liaison walked at his right. And as they came up the steps, a scatter of applause broke out from the sign holders, and Pruitt acknowledged it with the slight measured nod of a man trying to look humble about something he is not humble about. Kelso came in through the side entrance at 8:20, alone in civilian clothes, and found a seat in the 4th row of the gallery, with the particular invisibility of someone who has made themselves as small as possible in a room full of people who know the shape of the thing they are watching. Nadia arrived at 8:40 with Harold beside her. No security, no entourage, and the press moved toward her in a wave that she walked through without pausing, her eyes forward. And the navy blue folder was in her left hand at her side, and the black pin was on her lapel where it always was. She wore dark gray, the same color the sky had been when she stood under the courthouse overhang 6 days ago, and her heels were new. She had replaced the cracked ones, and they made a clear, even sound on the marble steps that several people would remember later without knowing why. Inside courtroom 4B, the gallery filled to capacity before the session opened, and the air had the closed, pressurized quality of a room where a large number of people are all trying to read what is going to happen next from the faces of the people in front of them. The wooden surfaces held the faint smell of lemon oil and dust, and the overhead lights had the yellow warm tint of institutional lighting that has never been replaced. And Judge Caroline Beaumont's bench sat empty and authoritative at the front of the room, while the bailiff arranged papers with the methodical calm of someone who has seen everything. Pruitt sat in the front row of the gallery, not at the witness table yet, and he had one arm resting along the back of the bench and his feet arranged comfortably, and he was talking in a low voice to his union attorney in the easy conversational register of a man who considers the outcome of the next several hours to be essentially settled. Kelso sat 2 rows behind him and did not move and did not speak and kept his hands on his thighs very still. Judge Beaumont came in at 9 sharp, and the room rose and settled, and she arranged her materials with the crisp, economical movements of a woman who did not waste seconds, and she looked around the courtroom once not as a survey, but as a calibration, the way you take the temperature of a room you are about to be responsible for. And then she nodded at the special prosecutor. The special prosecutor, a careful, methodical man brought in from Cobb County, named Gerald Fitch, who genuinely believed he was here to prosecute a straightforward narcotics case and had no idea of the nature of the ground he was standing on, called his first and only witness. And Pruitt stood and buttoned his jacket and walked to the stand with a pace that was just slightly slower than necessary. calibrated to read as dignified, and he placed his left hand on the Bible and raised his right, with the smooth, uncomplicated ease of a man who has done this many times in this room and found it uniformly agreeable. Under Fitch's direct examination, Pruitt was everything he had practiced, being clear, measured appropriately grave, the portrait of a veteran officer performing an unpleasant duty with professional integrity. He made eye contact with Judge Beaumont rather than with the audience. He paused before answering longer questions in a way that suggested careful consideration. When he reached the part about finding the bag, he paused for one beat, a single controlled hesitation that was designed to look like the weight of professional regret, and then described the discovery in clean, precise language that matched his written report, almost word for word, which was not surprising, because he had written the report to be delivered aloud in exactly this way. Fitch sat down with the satisfied posture of a man who has built what he intended to build. Harold West stood up and buttoned his own jacket, and he did not pick up the legal pad on the table in front of him or the pen beside it, or any piece of paper at all, and he walked to a position in the middle of the open floor, between the tables and the bench, with his hands loose at his sides, and he looked at Pruitt on the stand for a moment without speaking, in the relaxed, unhurried way of a man who has all the time in the world and knows it. Officer Pruitt Harold began, and his voice was conversational, almost warm. 22 years on the force. That's an impressive tenure. You've testified in this building dozens of times. Am I right? That's correct. You know how this works. You understand the gravity of what it means to swear an oath in this room. I do. Good. Harold took one easy step to the side, as if finding a more comfortable angle. Let's make sure we're perfectly clear then, for the record, because what you've put in front of this court is a sworn affidavit and a signed official report, and I want to make certain there's no ambiguity about what you've testified to. You stated under oath that my client's vehicle crossed the double yellow line. You are absolutely certain of that. I am. You stated under oath that upon approaching the vehicle, you detected a strong, unmistakable odor of marijuana. Absolutely certain. Absolutely. And you stated under oath, Harold's voice remained exactly the same. No change in pace or temperature, which made the question land with the precision of something dropped from a great height, that the bag recovered that evening came from beneath the passenger seat of my client's vehicle. Not from your person, not from your pocket, from beneath that seat. You are prepared to stand behind that statement before this judge under penalty of perjury right now today. Pruitt leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the rail of the witness box, and he looked at Harold with the full weight of 22 years of doing exactly this. I found those drugs exactly where I said I found them, Perfect Harold said, and he turned to the bench. Your Honor, the defense moves to introduce Exhibit A. Pruitt's grip on the rail did not change, but the rest of him went very still. The monitors in the courtroom, one large flat screen on the wall to the judge's left, a smaller one angled toward the jury box, which was empty today, but served as a secondary display, came on simultaneously with a quiet, electronic tone, and the image that appeared was split down the middle. On the left, the wide-angle interior view from the dash cam mounted below the rearview mirror. On the right, the chest and above view from the lapel pin capturing the driver's side window and everything beyond it. The timestamp in the lower right corner of both feeds read 11:58 p.m., November 18th, and the location data placed it at the intersection of Eastfield and Dupree. And the image quality was the sharp, undeniable clarity of something that does not need to be interpreted. The court reporter, who had been typing at a sustained professional rhythm for the past 40 minutes, set her fingers down on the keys and did not type. A journalist in the third row of the gallery stopped writing mid-sentence in her notebook and looked up at the screen and kept looking. Fitch at the prosecutor's table shifted his chair, so it was angled slightly away from the monitor, which was not a conscious decision, but which everyone in the room noticed. Kelso in his row lifted his head for the first time since the session began and looked directly at the screen, and his jaw moved once as if he was about to say something, and then it stopped. The footage showed Pruitt's search of the driver's side, the scattering of the console contents. The briefcase inverted the thorough and demonstrative chaos of it, and then the camera angle shifted as Pruitt moved to the passenger side, and the dash cam's wide-angle lens captured what followed with a completeness that left nothing uncertain. The left hand moving downward toward the floor, The pause, the hand emerging on an upward trajectory from the cargo pocket rather than from below seat level, the 2-second transfer, the sweep under the seat, the emergence of the bag into the overhead light. Harold let it run to the natural end of the relevant segment, and then he pressed pause. The frame froze on Pruitt's hand at the moment the bag became visible, hand angled upward, not downward, the geometry of the movement completing itself in silence on the screen. The courtroom was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible. On the witness stand, Pruitt's face had undergone a process that happened in layers, the way color drains from something first, the studied composure, then the expression beneath it, then something older and more unguarded and much harder to look at. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at the screen and then looked away from it, and then looked at it again as if the image might have changed in the interval, and of course it had not. Harold turned from the monitor and looked at Pruitt on the stand with an expression that contained no triumph. Just the mild, steady attention of a man waiting for an answer to a question he has already heard answered by the evidence. Officer Pruitt Harold said, "Would you like to revise any part of your sworn testimony?" The sound that came out of the gallery was not a shout or a cry. It was something more like a collective exhale. 30 people breathing out at once, the sound of a held thing being released. And Judge Beaumont's gavel came down twice, and then a third time, and she said, "Order," in a voice that did not need to be loud, to be absolute. And the room came back to itself, and Pruitt was still on the stand, and the image was still on the screen, and nothing that had been true before the footage played had changed, except that now everyone in the room knew it. Judge Beaumont did not rush. She let the room settle until it was genuinely quiet. Not the tense, straining quiet of before, but a different kind. The kind that follows something irreversible. And then she removed her glasses and set them on the bench in front of her and looked at Derek Pruitt on the witness stand with the particular measured attention of a woman who has spent 3 decades in courtrooms and understands that what she says in the next 2 minutes will matter for a very long time. "Officer Pruitt," she said, and her voice was not raised, and it did not need to be. "You appeared in this courtroom this morning under oath. You filed a sworn affidavit before this court. You have just watched, along with every person in this room, high-definition footage that directly contradicts each of those sworn statements, and I'm going to give you exactly one opportunity to speak before I act." Pruitt opened his mouth, and the first thing he said was the worst thing he could have said, which was, "That footage is manipulated." His voice came out rougher than he intended, cracked at the edges, missing the authority he'd walked in with. "You can't just, I have 22 years. I have a record of service in this department." "You can't." "I can," Judge Beaumont said, and she picked up her pen. "And I will." She issued her orders in the clear, sequential language of someone who has already completed the thinking and is now doing the speaking. Pruitt was to be taken into custody immediately on charges of criminal contempt of court, aggravated perjury, filing a false police report, and tampering with evidence. She was further recommending that the district attorney's office open a full criminal investigation into the conduct documented in the footage, and that all convictions secured by Pruitt's testimony in the past decade be placed under formal review. Pruitt stood up from the witness stand when the 2 deputy sheriffs approached, and he said something about the union and something about his brother-in-law's position in the department and something about what this was going to mean for the people who did this to him. And as he spoke the words, his eyes moved around the courtroom, looking for someone who was going to stop this. And he found no one. The union president in the gallery had already turned toward the exit door and was moving through it with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of a man removing his name from a situation before it fully congeals around him, and none of Pruitt's colleagues in the gallery were meeting his eyes. The handcuffs were standard issue applied at the wrists with a clean professional snap. The sound was a very specific metallic click-click, the ratchet finding its place, the cuff settling against the wrist, and it was in its acoustic signature, identical to the sound Nadia had heard standing beside her car in the rain at the Shell station on Eastfield 6 days ago, and she heard it now from where she sat at the defense table, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and her face was completely still. Pruitt was walked down the center aisle of the courtroom in his dress uniform with all of its commendations still pinned to his chest. And as he passed the defense table, he turned his head and looked at Nadia, and she looked back at him with the full, quiet weight of someone who prepared for this moment for 3 months and is not going to do anything with it now, except let it be exactly what it is. Then from the fourth row of the gallery, a sound, a chair moving, and then a voice. And it was Ryan Kelso's voice, and it was breaking in the way voices break when a person has been holding something for too long and has finally run out of the ability to hold it. He was standing with both hands raised, not because anyone told him to, and the tears on his face were real and not performed, and when he spoke, the words came out in a disordered rush. That was the most honest thing said in that courtroom all morning. He told me to sign it, or he'd have me blacklisted. There was no marijuana smell. There was nothing in that car. I watched him take the bag out of his own pocket, and I didn't say anything, and I signed a sworn report saying I didn't see that, and I should have. I'm sorry, Ms. Cole. I'm sorry. The room erupted, and Judge Beaumont let it run for 3 full seconds before she brought it back. And when the room quieted, it was with the feeling of something having cracked open and been looked at honestly for the first time. Frank Odom called Nadia at 7 the following morning, and the conversation lasted 4 minutes. And when it was over, she drove to the DA's office and walked into his room, and he was standing at the window when she arrived, not at his desk, and the reinstatement order was on the edge of the desk already signed, and he said her name once when she walked in, and then he did not say anything else, and she picked up the order and read it, and set it back down, and nodded, and left. At 7:15, 4 people in dark jackets arrived at the 14th precinct without announcement and showed their GBI credentials to the officer at the front desk and asked to be taken to the evidence room, and the request was complied with in the complete cooperative silence of an institution that has abruptly understood the dimensions of what it is standing inside. Kelso sat in the parking lot of the precinct that same morning for a long time before going in, not his car this time, a rental, because his cruiser had been impounded as part of the evidence protocol, and when he finally went through the doors, he was carrying nothing, no bag, no notebook, because he was there to give information, not to document it, and he had nothing left to hold on to anyway. 31 case files bearing Pruitt's name as arresting officer were placed under formal review. Within 48 hours, the number arrived at not by anyone's editorial judgment, but by a straightforward accounting of every conviction that rested substantially on Pruitt's sworn testimony, and a paralegal in the DA's office printed the list and placed it in a box and carried the box to Nadia's office and left it on her desk. The box sat on her desk for the rest of the day with its lid on waiting. On Monday morning, Nadia arrived at the DA's office at 7:40 and walked through the hallway where she had walked every day for 6 years, and the people she passed nodded at her in the quiet, direct way of colleagues who do not need to make a ceremony of something that is simply the right order of things being restored. She unlocked her office, set down her bag, and stood for a moment in the particular stillness of a room that has been empty for a week, the faint smell of her coffee still lingering, somehow the stack of files exactly where she had left them, the yellow legal pad with her handwriting on it still open to the last page she'd written on, and then she took the black pin from her bag and pressed it back into the lapel of her blazer, and she felt the single confirming pulse beneath her fingertip, and she sat down. The box from the paralegal was on the corner of her desk. She lifted the lid. Inside was the list of 31 names printed in the DA's office standard font, single-spaced each one a person whose conviction rested on the word of a man who had just been taken out of a courtroom in handcuffs. She looked at the first name for a moment, a name she did not recognize. A person the system had processed and filed away and moved on from years ago, and she pulled her keyboard toward her and opened a new case file. She had work to do, and she began. 3 weeks later, Derek Pruitt sat in the waiting room of an overextended public defender's office in a beige button-down shirt he had bought at a department store because his dry cleaner had returned his dress uniform to the department along with a formal letter he did not finish reading. He was sitting in a plastic chair that faced a wall with a water-stained ceiling tile above it, and there were 4 other people in the room, and none of them looked at him, not because they recognized him, but because they were each inside their own particular version of the same waiting. And when his name was called, he stood and followed a young woman with a case file that was much thinner than it was going to be, and went into a small office and sat down across from a desk and waited some more. He did not look like a man who had spent 22 years deciding things about other people. He looked like a man who had forgotten that he was ever anything other than someone waiting to be told what would happen to him next. Ryan Kelso was in a conference room at the GBI offices that same morning, giving his third voluntary statement, and when the investigator asked him why he had not spoken up, the night of the stop, Kelso was quiet for a long time. The investigator noted 11 seconds in the written record which he measured, because the silence was not the silence of someone searching for an answer, but the silence of someone who already had one and was deciding whether he had earned the right to say it out loud. He didn't answer the question directly. He looked at his hands and then back up at the investigator and said, "I think I understood what was happening, and I was afraid of what it would cost me to say so, and I made the wrong choice." He paused. "I need to make sure what comes after this is a different kind of choice." The investigator wrote that down too. 11 seconds of silence, exactly as long as Nadia had stood under the courthouse overhang in the rain on the night it all began pressing the pin to her lapel, feeling the single pulse that meant the device was on and recording and ready before she stepped forward into everything that followed. If this story moved you, if you saw something in it that felt true, that felt like something you've witnessed or lived through or hoped for, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this exist because people like you believe that justice, when it finally arrives, deserves to be witnessed. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. We'll be here.